The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So wrote William Butler Yeats in his poem, The Second Coming. It seems that for the Joe Biden administration, the center has indeed begun to collapse. His team of experts cower away from their assigned roles. Private sector is being asked to deal with problems caused by government interference. And on the world stage, well, things just got a whole lot more dangerous. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Well, we have a packed show today full of daring do and deep dives. We'll tackle the dangers we face from China, the supply chain debacle, and how California has become the petri dish for all things progressive, and even what's happening to impact you and your liberty this week. I'd like to thank our listeners on WBCH out in Hastings, Michigan on 1220 AM and 93.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get the ball rolling. If you thought the fallout from Afghanistan was over and done with, think again. With global politics, it's fair to say that what happens in one hemisphere impacts what happens in the other. And the embarrassment of the Afghan withdrawal was no different. Ever since President Biden oversaw one of America's most humiliating foreign policy debacles, Chinese President Xi Jinping has become a lot bolder in his efforts to destabilize Taiwan. Now, would China be on this path if Trump was still the president? And what options does a demonstrably weak President Biden have left? Well, there's no one better to answer these questions than retired U.S. Air Force pilot, author, and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Welcome back, Dave. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
So tell me, Dave, this situation in Taiwan, you compared it to boiling a frog. Care to explain?
Sure, Mark. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it has enough sense to jump out. But if you put a frog in tepid water and gradually turn up the heat, you can boil the frog quite nicely. And from a geopolitical standpoint, this is exactly what's happening to the Biden administration. No single Chinese affront to the United States is enough for us to go ballistic over them. However, little by little, the Chinese Communist Party is chipping away at the United States' credibility around the world. And the Biden administration is giving them every assistance.
Well, now President Biden, he's continuing with the rhetoric that China is a competitor rather than an adversary. I have to ask, does China see it the same way?
Absolutely not. China sees the United States as a pesky speed bump on their way to global economic and military domination. And as a consequence, they'll take a week or they'll take 100 years. It doesn't make any difference to them. They are resolute in what they intend to do in dominating the world. They are not only an economic competitor, but they are, in fact, a military adversary. We need to understand that, and that's how they see us.
Yeah, I think one of the more worrying aspects of the proposed incursions into Taiwan that's being promised by the Chinese Communist Party leadership is that Taiwan holds a lot of resources for superconductors, which are needed in just about every electronic project that the US government is doing. Now, obviously, these conductors were also made in Texas as well until government shutdowns caused those factories to give up. Now, isn't this just another way for China to claim supremacy in the electronic age? And what will the US have to do to, what hoops will they have to jump through? What knees will have to be bent to gain the much needed resources?
Well, the aspect of the dominance in superconductors in the Pacific is just one element of a much greater geopolitical issue that Taiwan presents. I believe that most Americans see Taiwan as, well, that place, that island, that small place over in the Pacific, and every now and then you hear about it. But Taiwan has taken on a far more significant geopolitical position in the world. You bring up a very good point. We are held hostage in many cases to superconductors, to microelectronics, to all manner of manufacturing that comes through a supply chain through the Pacific. And the United States has to realize it has to change the way in which it views the world and how it needs to do business from now on. Last year's National Defense Authorization Act made a very major stride in what we call onshoring, bringing those capabilities back to the United States. But we've got a long way to go in order to reestablish the United States as a major manufacturer, developer, and portion of the supply chain.
One more question on this particular topic, Dave. It seems to me that Japan fears that if Taiwan falls, Japan itself is next. Is that realistic, or is that just paranoia from one of the larger competitors in the region?
Well, I don't think that in the event that Taiwan would fall, that Japan would be immediately next, but it certainly is a stepping stone to what the Chinese have in mind in terms of dominating the globe.
Okay, now we can't let you go without examining the latest from Afghanistan. Now, in a recent meeting, the US representatives, they asked for help from the Taliban in dealing with ISIS and the other terror groups in the region. And the Taliban's response was quite simply, no. So where does this leave the US and its mission against terrorists? And did the US just become a lot less safe?
Well, I think to the last part of your question first, yes, the United States becomes a lot less safe. But more importantly, it was very interesting what the Taliban said, that they under no circumstances would provide any assistance in containing al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that might emerge within Afghanistan. But they also said that they could take care of these problems themselves. They could take care of Daesh. Now that's maybe a little bit subtle, but it's very clever, because what they've done is they've taken a global terrorist issue for which the United States is deeply concerned and turned it into a Afghanistan internal security problem, which is not what we're thinking at all. Now, you combine that with their warning about the United States flying drones over Afghanistan, and now you've got a situation where not only do they refuse to help, but they're going to be pesky in how we deal with the problem, because we could. It's not beyond our capability to, when ISIS or Al-Qaeda decide to put up a training camp, for it to go away the very next day.
Do we have any allies in the region who are willing to help, or is this really game over for the US on the war on terror in that region?
Honestly, I believe we're in a situation where we will always have some level of support from NATO and the EU, but in the region, it's going to be a matter of developing the ally du jour for each and every encounter that we have, because the equities that Pakistan and all the other stands have are not uniform, and they vary with each event and activity. So it's going to be a matter of the negotiating position at the time and place.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. It's always good to be on your program.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the coming battle between Texas and the federal government over vaccine mandates. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Andrew Moran to find out why Mayor Pete is MIA.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
It seems that the dream team put in place by President Joe Biden has become just that, a dream. Fleeting, difficult to remember, and gone almost the instant you wake up. Kamala Harris missing from the border, Mayorkas in a mess, and at the height of all these crises, American shelves are starting to empty. Where is Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg? And why is he getting a hall pass to wander where he may from the legacy media? Well, to help us with this conundrum, we're joined by economics guru Andrew Moran. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Pete Buttigieg, he's in charge of transportation. We have container ships stuck in ports, supply chain issues aplenty, and he's not even involved in these supposed infrastructure deals facing Congress. So where's Pete? And more importantly, what should he be doing right now?
Well, I want Pete Buttigieg or anybody else away from this file. They have a terrible track record of just ruining everything. So, if you had another, member of the team in the White House intervening, it's just going to get worse. So I'm glad he's staying away from this file.
To be fair, Andrew, Pete Buttigieg has zero track record on anything to do with transport, except I believe he likes trains.
Bada boom. Nice. But, he has made a couple of announcements in the last couple of days. It was just on Wednesday morning, he announced that the administration is going to establish a 90-day sprint to keep the West Coast ports open 24/7 to help ease the supply chain bottlenecks. But he also noted that there isn't much the government can do about it because it is a private sector issue. Although at the same time, why is this an issue? It's because of the government in the first place that led to this whole supply chain crisis. But, what I'm concerned about is if the press and the public keep demanding a federal response, then the White House is going to inevitably intervene, and I said before, they're just going to make matters worse, or they're going to try to impose these interventionist foreign policies that will lead to greater long-term consequences. Particularly if they impose their will, then it's going to lead to price hikes, because anytime the government gets involved in something, there's always a greater cost borne onto the consumer. So I have more faith that the private sector is going to resolve this problem than I do of any administration official.
Okay, in the United Kingdom, we have a shortage of heavy goods vehicle drivers at the moment, truck drivers essentially, and this is what's causing the empty spaces on the supermarket shelves, and it's being blamed on Brexit, of all things. But it seems that over 54,000 British drivers are awaiting the bureaucrats to approve their paperwork to drive presently the heavy goods vehicles. And it kind of ties in with what you're saying there, that the government response is likely going to be bad, but it's already the government response that has caused the issues within the private sector. So is this similar to what's happening in the US? Is government red tape getting in the way of solving problems, or was government red tape responsible for starting the problems in the first place?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, because government legislation, even going back, decades ago, are still are having problems today. So, for example, there's been some discussion among White House officials of working with the 100-year-old bill, the Jones Act. I've written about this during the Puerto Rican crisis. Now, I don't know if you were alive back then, but in the 1920s, it was a protectionist measure that regulated maritime commerce to support American workers. Now, the issue is that this restricts foreign flag ships and U.S. vessels that don't meet the crewing requirements. So this prevents them from carrying cargo between the U.S. ports. So will this resolve the problem? It might alleviate it. It may not solve it entirely, but it's just one step that you could take that accomplishes two things. It gets the government out of the way and helps ease the pressures on these ports, either on the West Coast or the East Coast.
All right, let's expand our conversation a little here. The Fourth Estate, they're demanding answers, or at least they used to demand answers if a government boss was missing in action in any of the prior administrations. There would have been hell to pay on the front page of the nation's papers. Now, you point out that having another government administrator involved might not be a good thing, but why are the media so invested in Joe Biden that they're willing to just look past people being missing in action?
Well, there's a great song from an old Fred Astaire movie and Ginger Rogers. It's they put all their eggs in one basket and they bet everything they got on Joe Biden. If they continue to report on how bad of a job Joe Biden is doing, it makes them look foolish because they were more outraged about tweets and conspiracy theories on social media. So if they're showing Biden in negative light, it embarrasses them because they put all their positive coverage on Joe Biden. Ultimately, it's just that the horse in the race is falling behind, and they don't want to spotlight it anymore. That said, I would come to the defense of Joe Biden because this problem would have happened regardless of last year's election results, whether it was Trump or Biden. Like inflation, everything we are seeing today would have inevitably going to transpire whoever was sitting in the Oval Office. So I have to give Biden some credit that it's not entirely his doing. It's just that it's happening under his watch. So of course, just adds to the terrible record so far of his job, of his tenure.
For me, whenever I hear about supply chain issues, my first thought is, this is why we need to be completely independent. But the idea that the whole world has to rely on the rest of the world for basics like food and energy, this strikes me as lunacy. Now, I'm not sure you have the same vision here, Andrew, but what are your thoughts?
Okay, so I wrote about this very thing early last year when I started warning about and started writing about the growing supply chain problem, especially in the aftermath of COVID in China. And I wrote about how the trade protectionists, they would exploit these mounting problems and revel in this, in this once in a lifetime problem. So no, I'm not in favor of supply chain nationalism. There are many risks in international supply chain as you would domestically. So let's go back in time a little bit earlier this year in Texas. Now, one of the notable shortages in the global marketplace right now are the chips, the semiconductors. Now, everyone's losing their minds about how there is enough chips. Automobiles aren't going to produce. Computers aren't going to be sold. All that stuff. But here's the thing: the U.S. has been producing these chips, but what happened? These factories in Texas were shut down by the government early this year during the winter storm, as per, I think it was Greg Abbott's orders. Samsung has 2 factories in Texas. A Dutch chip company also has 2 factories in Texas. So they were producing chips, but the government shut them down. So now people had to resort to foreign markets, which is a positive thing because of what happened domestically. In your backyard in Europe, as we noted in a recent Ellen Radio edition, an energy crisis is intensifying over there. The continent is going to have to rely on whom? Russia. Russia is now going to export oil, gas, and coal to this region to keep the lights on.
Okay, so as world leaders push nations further towards globalism, whether the citizens want it or not, are we going to see more or less supply chain issues, and why?
No, I think that the supply chain issues are going to eventually get resolved in the future. This isn't going to happen perpetually. The private sector is going to come up with solutions. Now, when it comes to globalism, I think you and I have still had a discussion again. I think it was a couple of years ago to distinguish between globalism and global trade. Globalism is more like international big government and cronyist trade agreements and politicians eroding your sovereignty, all that stuff. But international commerce is if let's say John Smith from Alabama, he wants to import T-shirts from John Z in Guangzhou. That's what global commerce is. It's not just George Soros sitting behind a desk and plotting his tyranny on the public. So
not yet, anyway.
It's great. It's great to have an international supply chain. Goods are cheaper for a lot of low and middle income families. That's a positive. So supply chain, everything going on right now, the shipping container crisis, it's going to be resolved, not for several more months, but it's going to happen.
But of course, this ideal future all relies on government staying out of the way.
That is an excellent point. But of course, we know the government never stays out of the way, but they wouldn't stay out of the way either if everything was coming out of Texas or California or New York. Government still would intervene and oppose its will.
Absolutely. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up on the show, we'll be talking liberty with Scott Cosenza. But next up, we're asking, how did California become such a pit of progressivism? Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And I just want to say thank you for listening and give a special shout out to those of you listening on KBKW 103.5 FM and 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor, Washington.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Get woke, go broke. A catchy phrase, no doubt, and one that has in the past proved true enough. But it's not always the case. Sometimes going woke leads to lucrative agreements, media lavishing praise, and even government regulations that just might drown your competitors. So where does that leave California? Well, the Golden State is the vanguard of all things woke and progressive, and certainly has the credentials and the cash. But beneath that huge economy in Sunlit Hills, we see drug addiction, homelessness, crime, and an exodus of folks and companies, I'm looking at you, Elon Musk, to more business-friendly shores. Well, to figure out just how far California is willing to go, we're joined by author and podcaster and Californian-born man about town, Jeff Charles. Welcome back to the show. So, Jeff, we're used to hearing just about every progressive woke idea that comes originally from the Golden State. Now, why has this otherwise paradisical plot of land become the petri dish for progressive experimentation?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, California has become arguably the bluest state in the union. It wasn't always that way, but the entire California government is run by Democrats. Republicans have very little say in what goes on, and the way the system is set up, it is the way California's electoral system is set up is in a way that was designed to effectively benefit Democrat officials who are running for state or even local offices. So that is in large part responsible for the increasingly leftist turn towards socialism that we're seeing out of California right now. It's worse than it's ever been.
Okay, so what's the latest Frankenstein's monster of wokeness on the cards for the poor folk of the West Coast?
Yes, well, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed a series of very woke proposals this past weekend. Things like mandating ethnic studies in high school as a requirement for graduation. He also signed a bill into law that would compel companies or retail stores that sell toys, they have to now have a section for gender neutral toys, or they will be fined. And this, I believe this goes into effect either in 2023 or 2024. He's also banned gas powered lawnmowers. So again, this is where California is going, and it doesn't seem like anything's going to pull it back from the brink just yet.
So Elon Musk just announced that a large chunk of his production, Tesla production, is moving down to Texas, the same place you moved to. Now, It makes sense from a business point of view, I guess. Lower taxes, less intrusive government regulation. But he's getting some pushback from critics who say that he sucked up all the benefits and the subsidies. But surely he's paid that debt off, right? They can't expect him or any other business owner to stick around when things become more and more punitive, can they?
Of course not. It would be completely unreasonable. And Tesla is just one of many major businesses who have moved their headquarters to Texas, especially to Austin, to here in Austin. I can't blame him for moving. Nobody can. The fact of the matter is that it is easier to do business in Texas than it is in California. They have a very unfriendly business environment there. This is going to keep happening. We're going to see more and more companies moving to places like Texas or other red states in the union.
Okay, now there's a certain mythology to La La Land, and by extension, the state of California. It draws in a steady crowd of those hoping to make their names, from the entertainment industry to businesses, some of those looking to cash in on the very generous subsidies that the government does offer from the taxpayer purse. But there are masses of problems that these folks with these stars in their eyes, they just seem not to see. They don't see the drug addicts, the defecating in the streets, the rapes, the muggings, the murders. So what causes this ideological blindness, do you think?
You know, it's funny. It's always been this way. People talk about, I want to go to Hollywood. I've been to Hollywood many times. It's pretty nasty. It's been that way for a while. Now, there are a lot of nice areas of Hollywood, but that's kind of the same for the rest of the state. There are very nice areas of Los Angeles and very not so nice areas. I'd imagine the same is true in San Francisco as well. But when you see California in the media, they're not talking about the stuff that's going wrong, especially nowadays. They're not talking about the homeless issues. They're not shining a light on those things. You have to essentially look online or look for sources who will actually report on that. Largely, it's political. They don't want the rest of the country to know that the progressive governance in Californian cities has been abysmal. So I can't blame people for coming to California and thinking that it's all glitz and glamour. Yeah, that's a part of it, but there's a whole other side of it as well.
Yeah, I think part of that stems from you've got your main Democratic Party leaders. You've got your Nancy Pelosi, your Adam Schiff, and literally in their constituencies, there are homeless camps and just crime rates and generally quite disgusting places to live. And so I think if it were portrayed in the media, then people would think, well, if this person can't even do something for the district that they're representing, what can they do for the country? Do you think it's an element of that?
Yeah, I think that's why they avoid showing the bad areas. I mean, and this is also true of other states, like in Baltimore. Before, President Trump said something about it, people weren't paying attention to what was going on in Baltimore. But people who were in the know, they know how badly these places are governed. I mean, even their mayors and city councils. It's horrible. I mean, Walgreens had to shut down 5 more stores in the San Francisco area because their brain surgeon government decided to allow people to shoplift. So these are prime examples of how progressivism doesn't work, but they have to cover this stuff up because they don't want people to know it.
Let's clarify that for just a moment, please, Jeff. So the local government allowed people to shoplift or decided not to pursue prosecution against those that do?
That's a distinction without a difference, really. I mean, they're not
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, they are essentially allowing it by refusing to prosecute it. So it's not just Walgreens. Other stores, even small business owners, they can't do anything. If somebody decides to come in and steal some stuff, as long as it's not over a certain dollar amount, they can steal it. And it's not like the governments are even trying to reimburse them for this or try to make it right. They're just letting it happen under the name of so-called progressivism. At this point, they know what they're doing, and they just don't care. They know this isn't going to help lift anybody out of poverty. They know that this is just going to cause destruction, and they don't care.
Yeah, it's who are they lifting out of poverty? The people who have just stolen the new shoes, or the new shoes that have just been the person who was supposed to sell the new shoes that they bought and put into their shop. Now, let's talk about Governor Newsom for a moment. He beat the recall election. There's a lot of folks happy about that. Slightly less who are unhappy. But I think, to me, it seems that the folks who voted for him, they didn't really understand what they were going to get. You see, they voted for the Newsom that they had, but not the Newsom that the opposition feared he would become. So as soon as he was in the clear of this recall election, I think they caught a glimpse of this newly emboldened governor, a Newsom 2.0, if you will. Your thoughts? Yeah,
I mean, Gavin Newsom dodged a bullet, and he got lucky because the candidate that was a front runner. They were able to use him. They were able to use Larry Elder to scare people to coming out and supporting Newsom. They weren't thinking ahead of what was going to happen. They just didn't want Larry Elder in the governor's mansion. And what happened is now that they have Newsom and he knows he's not in danger, he's going to keep going. I mean, the mandates that I just listed off, it's going to get worse for California. And hopefully they make some better decisions when he's up for re-election.
Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Right after this short break, we're talking liberty. What's happening at SCOTUS and what cases are going to impact you and your freedom. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The Supreme Court is back in session, and it seems the justices are under fire once again. Well, not quite all of them. The 3 liberal justices are getting praised as stalwart defenders of the faith, whereas the conservative bunch are accused of destroying America. Now, Chief Justice John Roberts appears stuck in the middle, and many are saying that Clarence Thomas is the new ideological center on the High Court. What's coming down the pipeline this week for liberty and law? Well, to help us figure that out, we're joined once again by constitutional lawyer and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back, Scott.
Hi, Mark. Thank you.
Before we get into cases, I want to address this idea that either Clarence Thomas or even perhaps Neil Gorsuch are the new ideological center at SCOTUS. So does this make sense, and what does it mean in practice?
Well, if we have a bar on a fulcrum and most of the weight is at one end of it, the center will position way off to the edge, right? So perhaps it's true that, as you say, that they are the center, but I don't think that's terribly meaningful in terms of where the country is or anything like that. It's just counting the votes. There was a time when Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was the most important justice in the United States of America. And in fact, the lawmaking went basically along the lines of, well, what will Sandra Day O'Connor approve of? That's what the country, that's what counted as constitutional. And then for a brief amount of time, that was true for Justice Roberts, but he's now off that with Trump's appointees. So it has been moving to the right. It's curious. I can't see myself saying that Clarence Thomas is the ideological center because he's for so long been so far out there compared to his other justices with his stalwart defense of a text-based reading of the Constitution rather than the wishful thinking that I ascribe to so many of the other justices, namely to the left of him.
Okay. So, I mean, I feel this, that we've seen a shift in how the Supreme Court is viewed, not just in how it operates. You mentioned on a previous episode that public faith in the court, public trust, has dropped to just 40%. Now, do you think this is because everything has become so politicized? I mean, we never saw such major protests at the Supreme Court before. It seemed it was always kind of expected that some decisions would go one way, some would go the other. But now it kind of feels as though angry, predominantly left-leaning, angry public are treating the justices just like another bunch of politicians, as if they can harass them like Kirsten Sinema, for example, in a public bathroom. What's your take on this?
Well, to the second question, I would say that I think we have seen actually protests like we see recently at the Supreme Court. What we haven't seen, though, and you left it out in your example list, was that Justice Kavanaugh's home was besieged by protesters. Now, I don't think that they made any violent moves, but just to have one's quiet enjoyment completely ruined over days with people shouting and demonstrating, I don't think we've seen that before at the justices' homes. To the question about the public mood, that was those numbers were reported by the Gallup poll, Mark, and I believe that they were taken right after some major news story about where the big box media just dumped on the Supreme Court for 72 hours. I don't think that it was I'm not suggesting Gallup coordinated that. I'm sure they had the poll in the mix before the news broke, but I think that's probably what drove those numbers so low. But yeah, the sense is that they are just political actors, and I think that that's not. I think that's a healthy reaction. The idea that these people are somehow, alabaster, non-human callers of balls and strikes is ridiculous.
All right, let's move on to the challenges faced by liberty this week. And I think one of the biggest cases is Texas Governor Greg Abbott. He banned private businesses from mandating vaccines for workers. Now, this is a direct contradiction to President Biden's federal mandate. Now, care to let us know who's going to win in this particular constitutional battle?
There's only losers in this constitutional battle, Mark, and they're the people.
As ever, Scott. I think that's the answer to everything. Who loses? People.
Yeah.
Yes.
They do, sadly. Yeah, it's both men acted without seeming authority, legal authority, that is. There's no federal law that seems to give the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Labor Department or the president or his secretary of labor the power to do this. It's, frankly speaking, preposterous that it would be okay for the president to just be able to come up with all these rules for on his signature for companies that affect, roughly a third of Americans, I think. The numbers are a bit nebulous to kind of nail down. And the same thing is true for Governor Abbott. It's really a shame. I think it's more of a shame for me, my reaction to the Abbott news rather than the Biden news. Biden has always sort of been a statist and acted in a way that doesn't necessarily respect the limits of government. But Abbott at least talks about that. And I even had a spokesperson say in August that they didn't think that the Texas government should regulate or run Texas businesses, that the business owners should do it. So this about face really seems to hurt in terms of a politician you thought was going to respect individual rights. But now the business owners in Texas, as I wrote about in the pages of LibertyNation.com, Mark, it's a 180-day or 6-month sentence that the statute authorizes if you violate the Texas governor's order.
But isn't this just really a reaction to try and neutralize Joe Biden's mandate.
Oh, it's a tit for tat thing politically. Yeah, but you say, isn't it just? Like, that doesn't take away the 180-day prison sentence for people who are who might violate this law, or the $14,000 fine that has been laid out as the federal penalty for non-compliance. So do you want to pay $14,000 or do you want to go to jail for up to 6 months? And there's also a smaller fine in the Texas example. So, yeah, it is just politics, which I think, honestly, it just makes Governor Abbott so diminished that he, too, really, I likened the two of them to two mafia families arguing over some turf, who you're going to pay up to and who you're going to give tribute to. And it just seems like that.
Paulie Walnuts always wins. Yeah. Now, why did Abbott actually do this? So surely he knew that this would face some legal challenges, but is he hoping that individuals will bring case after case and that will create an almost weight of impetus behind his position?
The Texas Statesman, I think the name of the publication is, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, reported that this was in some large part in response to his primary challenger, who was attacking him from the right. So perhaps that's it. This is rank speculation, but I will speculate that he thought it would get tossed out in court and he'd get the credit for trying to rebuff the Biden administration on the political front as, being a hero of those of us who think that vaccine mandates are immoral or violate the law or both, and not suffer the consequences of actually having to send people to jail for violating his law. That would be my guess. But I don't know that there's any facts in the record to show that's the case.
Another story I feel we should address is that of Loudoun County. Now, a father accused a school board of hiding or covering up sexual assault perpetrated on his daughter by a trans female in the school bathroom. Now, how credible are his allegations, both of the assault taking place and of the school board covering it up? And what's the fallout?
Okay, so the allegations are true, supported by, it happened, there was an arrest and there is an ongoing prosecution of this person who sexually assaulted a ninth grader in the bathroom of the school. What caused what's in the news now is it's being revealed that this parent who was kind of dragged out of a public school board meeting, the reason why is because the superintendent, Scott Ziegler, had said at the time that there was sort of no issue or problems with the trans bathroom issues that they were discussing. And the person who entered this girl's bathroom was a trans girl who then sexually assaulted this ninth grader. And so here's this father of a girl who was assaulted, a brutal assault, which was followed up by an arrest and a prosecution. Here, the superintendent of the school talk about how there's no issue, no problem. It's shocking that the school official would do that. This was at a school board meeting. Perhaps we're going to have to get the school board officials to take an oath to be under oath when they say these things. But that's what the story's about, and it is a fascinating kind of part of this story about bathroom access, where these trans activists seem to say that, it's preposterous to suggest that this is a security issue for young girls, which is what parents seem to be particularly motivated and animated about. And yet here we have a case in point where this is exactly sort of the worst fears, which is a person enters a bathroom, and attacks somebody.
It's surprising that it's the story about the father that is the big story, when really a sexual assault on a young girl hasn't made the papers so much, but a father being dragged from a school board meeting seems to tie in with Attorney General Merrick Garland's plans to set the FBI on parents who criticize school boards. Now, under Merrick Garland's plans, would this particular father also face threats from the FBI?
Oh, well, I don't want to even imagine what Merrick Garland thinks are appropriate prompts to generate an FBI investigation. I imagine this would be one, though.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio. Thanks to our guests, Scott Cosenza, Jeff Charles, Andrew Moran, and Dave Patterson. And as always, my sincere thanks to you at home for listening. It's a privilege for me, and I appreciate you all. A final thought for you, and circling back Jen Psaki style to William Butler Yeats, he ends the poem, "And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?" I think this is a question the administration is asking itself right now. Is the rough beast the calamity of poor decision-making? Is it another 3 years of crisis after crisis? Or is it an avenger, determined to put an end to the incompetence and the lies? Thanks for listening. Till next time.